right, so last week we got through just the first 6 verses of Revelation chapter 20, and tonight we're going to pick up at verse 7, but first I'm going to go to the back wall and revisit our timeline and just kind of remind us where we are in all this, because last week we talked about the 1,000-year reign, otherwise known as the millennial reign. It's a little bit redundant, but we just have it up there, 1,000-year and millennial, to let you know that there's going to be this 1,000-year period known as the millennial kingdom where Jesus will rule and reign on the earth for that 1,000 years. He returns at the end of the tribulation period, which is the Battle of Armageddon. He defeats those armies that have advanced against God and the God of and Israel and the God of Israel. And then he establishes his kingdom for 1,000 years. So that was last week's study. And we mentioned last week that there are 3 views of how to look at the millennial kingdom. There's the amillennial view, the postmillennial view, and the premillennial view. And I'm not going to regurgitate all of that. That was last week. You can go back and look it up. But I will emphasize our position, our view here at Cornerstone is the premillennial view, which is that Christ returns at the end of the 7 years of tribulation, which marks the beginning of the millennial period. Thus, he returns pre-millennial. He establishes his kingdom here on earth for 1,000 years. Believers will rule and reign with Jesus during the millennial kingdom. And the millennial kingdom will be life very consistent with the way life is now, with some really big exceptions. Satan is bound for that 1,000 years. Jesus will rule from Jerusalem. Christians will rule and reign with him. So we will help to administer as like mayors and governors to help manage and administrate the earth under Jesus as king. So there are no more earthly political leaders. There are no presidents, prime ministers, or kings. There's only one king. His name is Jesus. He's seated on the throne. He rules and reigns from Jerusalem for 1,000 years. What a glorious day that will be, right? Are you all awake tonight, or do I need to start over? All right, okay. Okay. Judgment of the tribulation survivors. There will be people who come through the tribulation, and Jesus will judge as righteous or unrighteous. We'll talk a little bit about that again tonight because it comes up. It'll be a time of peace and joy unparalleled. You talk about a time of peace, everybody wants world peace, but there will only be really world peace when the Prince of Peace is ruling in Jerusalem. So it'll be unprecedented, the kind of peace and joy that will be upon the earth. It'll be a time when animals will be tame. We looked into the book of Isaiah. Isaiah saw this day when children will play with snakes and not be harmed. And the lion and the lamb, and all of this, the way that animals used to be pre-flood. It wasn't until Genesis chapter 9, after the flood, when animals and mankind then had this contentious relationship. But that'll be restored. Even animals will be tame. It'll be a time of longevity. People will live, talk about centenarians now. I mean, people will live in that day past 100. If you die before 100, you'll be thought to have died at a young age. And it'll be a time of worshiping Jesus in Jerusalem. So that is the millennial reign, and that was last week. So that was just a quick review. Tonight we're going to be looking at the rest of chapter 20, which has to do with the lake of fire and also the great white throne of judgment. So that's where we are in verse 7 tonight of chapter 20. Let me read verse 7 down through the end of the chapter, and then we'll go back and dig out these verses. So Revelation 20, verse 7. Now when the 1,000 years have expired, at the end of the 1,000 years, Satan will be released from his prison and will go out to deceive the nations which are in the 4 corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together to battle, whose number is as the sand of the sea. And they went up on the breadth of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city, which is Jerusalem. And fire came down from God out of heaven and devoured them. The devil who deceived them was cast into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. And then I saw a great white throne, and him who sat on it, from whose face the earth and the heaven fled away, and there was found no place for them. And I saw the dead, small and great, standing before God, and books were opened. And another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged according to their works by the things which were written in the books. The sea gave up the dead who were in it, and death and Hades delivered up the dead who were in them. and they were judged, each one according to his works. Then death and Hades were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death, and anyone not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. And so we have this transition here where the beginning of chapter 20, it tells us that the millennial reign begins. Jesus is going to be reigning from Jerusalem for 1,000 years. And his first order of business is to bind Satan and to cast him into the bottomless pit, or the abusos, the abyss, for the duration of that millennial reign. So for 1,000 years, Satan is under lock and key in this abyss, this earthly cave that is somewhere in the center of the earth. And that's found here in verse 1 of chapter 20, where this angel is given authority by God, comes down, binds Satan literally with a chain, and casts him into the abyss for 1,000 years. So you have to try to imagine life during that 1,000 years. Jesus is king, and there is no influence of Satan on the globe. It's going to be a wonderful day. But again, remember, there will still be people living on earth during that 1,000 years, having children over the course of that 1,000 years. And even though there is no Satan, because he's bound at the time, they still have a sinful nature. Every person is born with a sinful nature. David talked about this in the book of Psalms when he said, surely from birth I was conceived in sin. And so mankind is born with a sin nature, with a propensity to sin, therefore. And so it's not like there's going to be no evil. It's not like there's going to be, zero sin and zero evil in the world. It'll just be greatly diminished without the influence of Satan. But mankind, still survivors into the millennial period, have a sin nature that has to be reckoned with. So there's still going to be sinful things happening on the earth, but Satan is going to be bound during that 1,000 years. Now, it tells us here at the beginning of the section we're looking at tonight in verse 7 that when the 1,000 years are over, that the Lord releases Satan again. And the question is, why? I mean, we like him just fine where he is, in the bottomless pit, bound with chains. But God is going to release Satan one last time. And the reason is because you have to remember that people who come into the millennial period of time, who still are in their fleshly bodies, and then they have children, and then they have children, successive generations are born during 1,000 years. None of these people have ever really had to make much of a choice. Because if you've got King Jesus on the throne, and the world is at the greatest level of peace and joy it's ever experienced, and Jesus is king, you've grown up in that. And perhaps you're even born and you died during that. There's not an opportunity for people to really make a profession of faith in Jesus when he's the only choice. And so God is going to allow Satan to be released so that the people of the millennial period in particular will have an opportunity to say, well, who are we going to choose now? It's easy to choose Jesus when he's the only choice. But mankind still has to be able to exercise the free will that God has given him or her in order to make a decision for Christ.